Hello everybody, this is Mark Hutten, and today I want to talk to those parents who are going to have an IEP done for their child. As many of you know, IEP stands for Individualized Education Program, and there seems to be a lot of questions and confusion about the process. So in this video, I'm going to try to simplify it as best I can, and we're going to look at what to do before, during, and after the IEP process. The formation of an individualized program involves 7 steps, and these are pre-referral, referral, identification, eligibility, development of the IEP, implementation of the IEP, and evaluation and reviews. So we'll look at each one of these in turn. Okay, step number 1 in the IEP process is pre-referral. Now, the IEP process is initiated through a series of pre-referral interventions, and the interventions implemented vary depending on the kind of problems that the child is having. The major purposes of this stage of the IEP process are to document and explain the student's difficulties and challenges, test the effectiveness of classroom accommodations and modifications, to assess the power of various instructional interventions, and to monitor the student's progress. In general, before any formal referral to special education is made, teachers and parents work together to see whether educational or behavioral difficulties can be resolved in the general education classroom. During this pre-referral period, teachers try different teaching approaches to determine whether faulty instruction is the source of the problem or is it something else. Okay, step number 2, referral. If pre-referral interventions are unsuccessful, then the child is referred for special education services. And these referrals can come from many different sources, for example, parents, social service agency, public health nurses, daycare professionals, or even a doctor. Usually these referrals come from teachers, students whose academic performance is significantly behind that of their classmates, or students who continually misbehave and disrupt the classroom, often draw the attention of their teachers, and thus the teacher usually makes a referral in that case. Okay, step number 3 is identification. The purpose of this step, the identification step in the IEP process, is to determine whether the child has a disability, whether special education is required, and what types of services are needed. Evaluations are conducted by multidisciplinary teams made up of professionals who have expertise in each area of concern, and each member helps to evaluate the student's unique strengths and needs. Information can come from a broad range of sources, for example, the child's parents, other family members, or daycare workers. The professional who coordinates the identification process varies by state and by district. In some states, the assessment team leader is a school psychologist or an educational diagnostician. In other states, a teacher from the student's school will be the one that will lead the team's efforts. At this step, many different types of data are used to inform the team about the student's abilities. For example, medical history, information about social interactions at school and at home, adaptive behavior in the community, educational performance, and other relevant factors are considered. Evaluations include an array of assessment instruments and procedures. Information should be collected about the child's major life activities, for example, his performance at home, his performance at school, in interpersonal relationships, and during leisure time. Formal tests, for example, tests of intelligence, academic achievement, and acuity, are part of the information used to make decisions about the students and their potential special education status. Tests about a student's learning style are often included to help identify accommodations that may be effective to support the child's successful access to the general education curriculum. Less formal assessments are also important pieces of the evidence for this step of the IEP process. For example, school observations of social behavior, academic assignments, direct measurements of academic performance, and portfolio samples of classroom performance. One result of the evaluation step of the IEP process can be determination that the child does not have a disability. In these instances, the IEP process is discontinued. For those children who do have disabilities, this phase of the process results in a baseline of performance that guides the development of the IEP and later will help evaluate the program's effectiveness. This brings us to step 4, which is eligibility. The information from the assessment step is used to identify students who actually have a disability and qualify for special education services. For those students, the IEP committee then determines what components of the full range of special education and related services are needed so that an appropriate education can be planned for and ultimately delivered. The education of those students who do not meet the eligibility requirements remains the responsibility of general educators. Now we're ready for step 5, which is the development of the IEP. After thorough completion of the pre-referral, referral, evaluation, and eligibility steps of the IEP process, it's time to develop the actual IEP and a transition component of the IEP for those students with disabilities who are 16 years or older. For those students who qualify for special education, this step requires that parents and the IEP team make decisions about appropriate education, services, and placement. The assessment results are used to help make these decisions. It is at this point, step 5, that the IEP team begins to work to outline the individualized education needed by the student of concern. Collectively, the team members, which includes the parents and the child as well, now use the knowledge they have gained to identify resources needed for the student to access the general education curriculum, to determine the appropriate goals for that child, and then to turn all of that knowledge into a good education program for the student. Now is the time when the constellation of services and supports that become part of the student's appropriate education are determined. Step 6. Implementation of the IEP. Once the IEP is developed, the student's services and individualized program begin. The IEP now lays out what constitutes an appropriate education for the student, the extent to which the student participates in the general education curriculum, the accommodations the student receives both for instruction and for testing, and the array of multidisciplinary services that support the student's education program. Minor adjustments in the student's goals don't signal a need for a new IEP or another IEP meeting. You would just continue services as normal. However, major changes in goals, services, or placement do require parents to be notified in writing. Some changes, particularly if they involve a more restrictive placement, may necessitate a meeting of the IEP team and the family. Most often this situation arises when issues surrounding discipline are the reason for the change in placement or services. This brings us to the 7th and final step, which is evaluation and reviews. The purpose of the IEP review meetings is to ensure that students are meeting their goals and making educational progress. Because accountability measures determine whether the student is making progress, educators are careful to describe expectations for tasks and skills the student needs to learn in terms that can be evaluated. The expectation is that frequent assessments of the child's performance will occur, even if major IEP reviews occur once a year or only every 3 years. So these are the 7 steps in the IEP process, and this process is meant to be deliberate and equitable, and the individualized program plans that it generates are the means by which the educational concepts are guaranteed to each student and that student's family.